Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 10 and we will be presenting on our topic, which is LGBTQ. So what is the definition of LGBTQ? The letter L stands for lesbian, which refers to women who are romantically or sexually attracted to other women. Meanwhile, G stands for gay, which refers to men who are romantically or sexually attracted to other men. Then B stands for bisexual, which refers to individuals who are attracted to more than one gender. T stands for transgender, which refers to individuals whose gender identity refers from their biological sex. For example, including women who identify or behave as men and men who identify or behave as women. Lastly, Q stands for queer or questioning, which refers to individuals who are still exploring or identifying their sexual orientation or gender identity. Next, I will explain some phenomena associated with LGBTQ. The first phenomenon is gender transition. Gender transitions refers to the process where a person changes their social, physical or legal identity from their biological sex to another gender identity. This may involve social changes such as changing their name or clothing, medical changes through hormone therapy or surgery, and legal changes by changing their gender on official documents. The second phenomenon is same-sex relationships. This refers to a romantic or sexual relationship between two people of the same sex, whether between two males or two females. In today's world, some countries even legally recognize same-sex marriage. The third phenomenon is cross-dressing. Cross-dressing means wearing clothing that is traditionally associated with the opposite gender. For example, men dressing in women's clothing or women dressing in men's clothing. People may cross-dress for various reasons, including self-expression, cultural or fashion influences, psychological reasons, or even for entertainment purposes. Next, I will discuss this issue from the perspective of Islamic faith. In Islamic faith, scholars generally recognize four categories, which is male, female, hunsa, and mukhannath. Hunsa refers to a person who naturally possesses characteristics of both sexes or has ambiguous genitalia. Since it is a natural condition, it is recognized in Islamic faith. Meanwhile, mukhannas refers to a man who resembles women or has feminine characteristics. Scholars further divide mukhannas into two types, which is mukhannas khalqi, which refers to natural feminine traits, and mukhannas takallufi, which refers to the intentional imitation of the opposite gender. I will explain these two categories in the next slide. The first is mukhannas khalqi. This refers to a man who naturally has feminine characteristics from birth, such as a soft voice or a gentle mannerisms. Since these traits are natural and not intentionally adopted, most scholars do not consider him sinful. The second is mukhannas takallufi. This refers to a man who intentionally imitates women through his clothing, appearance, speech, or behavior. The majority of scholars consider this prohibited because it is a deliberate imitation of the opposite gender. According to classical scholars, this contradicts the concept of fitrah, which refers to the natural disposition created by Allah. Next, I will discuss one of the arguments from pro-LGBTQ scholars and the response from classical scholars. Muslim Hendrik, which was a South African imam, Islamic scholars and LGBTQ activists, argues that the Quran does not explicitly condemn living same-sex relationships. He refers to Surah Ar-Rum verse 21 and Surah Yasin verse 36, arguing that the terms mate and pairs are not gender-specific. Therefore, he believes these verses may allow for different forms of human partnerships, including same-sex relationships. However, classical scholars disagree with this interpretation. According to classical tafsir, the term mates in Surah Ar-Rum refers to husband and wives. They also argue that marriage in the Quran is generally presented within a male-female framework, such as in discussion on inheritance, divorce, and dowry. In addition, Classical scholars explain that the term pairs in Surah Yasin refers to Allah's creation in general and does not specifically discuss marriage or sexual relationships. Therefore, they believe these verses should not be used as evidence to support same-sex relationships. Another argument presented by Mohsin Hendricks is that sexual orientation is not a choice. He argues that some people naturally experience same-sex attraction and therefore should not automatically be viewed as rebelling against God. This is reflected in his question, how can Allah create me this way and then condemn me for it? In response, classical scholars distinguish between feelings and actions. They argue that a person is not sinful simply for experiencing same-sex attraction or other desires. However, individuals are accountable for the actions they choose to take. Classical scholars also believe that people may be tested with different desires and challenges in life. Therefore, they viewed same-sex attractions as a test rather than a sin in itself, while actions should remain in accordance with the Sharia principle. Then, I will pass to the next presenter.
So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. My name is Rajin Ibrahim binti Rajin Muhammad Azan 2412368. And now I will be discussing on another argument that brought by the pro-LGBTQ scholars regarding the story of Prophet Lut alayhi salam. So some scholars such as Mohsin Hendrik and Dayi Abdullah, they argue that the people of Lut get punishment not because of their same-sex relation action, but then due to serious wrongdoing such as oppression, torture, violence, rape, and abuse of innocent people. So, based on this interpretation, they they claim that punishment that the people of Lut get was primarily result of this harmful and oppressive action rather than because of the same-sex relationship. However, the classical Islamic scholars strongly rejected this view because they argue that the Quran explicitly mentioned that one of the major sins that committed by the people of Lut because of this section, because of the same-sex relationship sin. So, therefore, classical scholars continue to regard that story of Lut as one of the strongest evidence regarding the prohibition of same-sex action in Islam. So to understand why the classical scholars strongly hold on to this position, we need to look at the Quran evidence itself. So moving on to another slide, as you can see here, it is one of the Quranic evidence that's used by the classical scholars, which is Surah Al-A'raf verse 60 until 84. So in this verse, Prophet Lut alayhi salam questioned his people on why they commit such as an immoral act that it is actually did not do by previous nation. And even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described how these people approach men in desire and instead of women. So because of this, the classical scholars consider this ayah as is very significant and it directly mentioned about the same-sex relationship that committed same-sex relationship that committed by the people of Lut alayhi salam. So, and even in this ayah, there is also mentioning that the people of the Lut alayhi salam rejected the advice that brought by Prophet Lut alayhi salam and continued their action despite being advised to change. Because of this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished them and saved people of Lut and believers. So, because of this reason, this verse frequently cited as evidence that homosexual is act that prohibited in Islam. So, besides Surah Al-A'raf, there is also another surah that classical scholars refer to, which is Surah Ash-Shu'ara, verse 165 and 166. So, in this verse, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala asks, why the people approach men and leave the wife that Allah created for them? So, um, there's interpretation by classical scholars, which is with this question, it is like an evidence that marriage and intimate relationship are intended to occur between men and women. So that from the verse Surah Ash-Shu'ara, verse 165 and 166. So another surah, which is Surah Hud, there is also verse that describe the arrival of angels at Prophet alayhi salam home. So when the angel come in the shape of human, so the people of Lut rush to his house to see the grass, but with improper intention. So Prophet Lut alayhi salam advised them by offering his daughter, but then the people reject and refuse instead of pursuing their desire. So, from this perspective of classical scholars, this passage reinforces that idea and behavior of the people of it was contrary to Islamic teaching and the natural order established by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. Therefore, this Quranic passage collectively form an important foundation for the traditional Islamic position on LGBTQ related issues. So, we take Al-Quran. The classical scholars also refer to the Hadith as important source of Islamic guidance. So, moving on to another evidence, which is we look at the Hadith. Some scholars often refer to the narration discussing about the same-sex relations and imitation of the opposite gender. And one of the hadith that narrated by Abu Musa al-Ashari, which is about the same-sex sexual relations between men and women, are described as sinful acts. So the classical scholars use this narration to support the understanding that both male and female homosexuals are prohibited in Islam. So, uh, scholars emphasize that Islamic teaching address not only action but also the moral values and social consequences that associated with those actions. So, for this reason, hadith literature play a really significant alongside the Quran in shaping Islamic ruling on this issue. So another hadith that used by the classical scholars to support the Quranic evidence, which is hadith that um, regarding the action the people of Lut, which has been interpreted as further evidence against the homosexual act. So, Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam cursed men who imitated women and women who imitated men. And from this, the scholars, which is Al-Tabari and Ibn Hajar, explain that imitation may include clothing, appearance, behavior, speech, and they do all of this intentionally to resemble the opposite gender. However, it is important to note that scholars also distinguish between the natural characteristics and deliberate imitation. So therefore, Islamic scholars generally consider intention and choice to be important factors when discussing this issue. So finally, let us take a look on why LGBTQ become such a complex issue into this today. So the first reason is related with religion and modern perspective, which is the religious teachings and modern human rights. So many religions, including Islam, regard LGBTQ as an act that prohibited based on religious text, while human, uh, when they have the ideology on human rights So they emphasize about the individual freedom, about the equality, and the right to express one identity. So that is first issue. Second is the reason between the differences in social values. So there is some societies that view LGBTQ as a part of diversity and personal freedom. However, the conservative society, um, they see this kind of people, which is the LGBTQ, as a conflicting with the cultural, moral, and religious values. And the last reason is the issue involving legal and political debate. So, about the legal issue, it is about the same-sex marriage, gender recognition law, and anti-discrimination policy that continue to generate discussion around the world. So as a result, different countries adopt different approach depending on their legal systems, their social conditions, and even the religion. So to conclude, the LGBTQ issue remain controversial because it sits at the intersection of religion, culture, law, morality, and even human rights. So this made it as one of the most debated social issues in the modern world. So that's all for me. Thank you.